occasional stories that were to be really enjoyed, really relished when they came out, because you couldn't have that um, each and every month. Closest we got to that, of course, was with books like the All Star Comics revival, All Star Squadron, Infinity Inc. But I mean, even their appearances by Earth One characters in those books were pretty minimal. The idea was that those books were set entirely on Earth Two, and I mean, thinking of the All Star Comics revival itself, I can think of only a couple of times where there were brief visits by Hal Jordan and Superman. So what all does this have to do with Earth B then? Well, during the later stages of the Silver Age and throughout the Bronze Age, readers were coming across a number of issues which presented stories that made them say, huh? These were stories which seemed to flagrantly violate the rules of travel between the different universes. And it led to some fans wondering if maybe they were reading stories that took place on an entirely different reality. Specifically, these stories tended to take place in Brave and the Bold and World's Finest Comics. I'm certainly more familiar with the stories that were written in Brave and the Bold, but I've read a couple of those World's Finest Comics myself, and it led me to wonder, were the writer or writers involved just not aware of certain elements of Earth One's history that were like really rooted in stone, or were they looking at something that was supposed to take outside of what was considered normal continuity? And a number of these stories involved Batman. The prime culprits are stories in which a Batman, who appeared to be the Earth 1 Batman, was teaming up with characters like Sergeant Rock, Wildcat, and the Spectre. And now I say a Batman who looked like the Earth 1 Batman because even in the Bronze Age, artists were showing physical differences between the Earth 1 and the Earth 2 Batman. The Earth 1 Batman had the Carmine Infantino designed New Look costume, so the longer bat ears, the blue and the gray costume. But what really stood out about the New Look Batman was the symbol. The bat was now set against a yellow oval. And so the Batman who appeared in these Brave and Bold and World's Finest comics was wearing that costume. It should also be noted that this Batman, like the Earth 1 Batman, was taller, leaner, still very well built, but had a much more lithe, agile look to him compared to the Earth 2 Batman, who tended to be depicted as a little shorter and much more broad-chested, certainly just broad all around, shorter bat ears. So looking at these stories, they clearly showed a much younger looking Batman who appeared in the bulk of DC and Batman stories from the Silver and the Bronze Age. And what was really curious about these stories was that this Batman was fighting alongside Sergeant Rock during World War II, but then also appearing in stories alongside Wildcat, looking like he hadn't aged a day. And I've spoken about a couple of Brave and the Bold issues in which Batman was seen teaming up with the Spectre. Now, when it comes to the Batman and Spectre team-ups in Brave and the Bold, thanks to the work of Roy Thomas, you could say, well, these stories actually did take place on Earth 1 because Roy Thomas established that at some point, I would say at the end of the first volume of the Spectre solo series, the Spectre was separated from the Earth 2 Jim Corrigan and then moved to Earth 1 and took up within the body of the Earth 1 Jim Corrigan. But even one of those Batman Spectre team-ups in Brave and the Bold showed a Batman wearing the new look costume, but not sounding at all like the Earth 1 Batman. He's a bit more of a jive talker. This was from the story where Batman appeared in public at a Gotham City Chinatown event. And he was just smiling and he didn't have his guard up, and it just felt like a different Batman, different from the Batman who was appearing in the Bat books at that time. But going back to Sergeant Rock and Wildcat team-up stories, there was no recap about the multiverse. And so that's what struck other readers, was that for whatever reason, there was no mention of that. And there was no mention as to how Batman was able to cross over to Earth 2 and team up with Sergeant Rock and later on with Wildcat. In fact, a reader could say, well, maybe these are Earth 1 stories. Maybe there was a Sergeant Rock on Earth 1. Maybe somehow Wildcat got to Earth 1. I'm just curious, given that in all of the other stories that DC was printing, there was always that mention about the the concept of the multiverse, and there was always an explanation as to which Earth the story was set on and how and why one character traveled from their native Earth to another Earth. And so fans started questioning DC. And at the time, DC had, I guess you could call it an editorial page. It was called The Daily Planet. And it was a precursor to Dick Giordano's Meanwhile page. The Daily Planet page usually, it looked kind of like the front page of a newspaper, actually. It even had the Daily Planet headline banner on it. And there would be 2 or 3 articles, mentions about upcoming books. In the bottom right-hand corner, Fred Hembeck would contribute a really funny, off-the-wall little cartoon. I remember one was with Barry Allen, where he recalled that one day he was so eager to run out into the street and start fighting crime that he didn't hear his wife say, "Barry, your costume is still in the laundry." And so he ran out into the street and he popped his flash ring open, and he realized, much to his chagrin, that people were no longer referring to him as the Flash, but they were referring to him as the Flasher. And for those of you who are familiar with Fred Hembeck's art, it just made for a really neat part of the page. But there was an Answer Man section in which editor Bob Rozakis would answer 1 or 2 questions from fans that were sent in the mail. And I forget which issue it was where I first read this, but I do know that the Daily Planet page was printed across several issues of several titles each month, maybe all of them. I can't quite remember. But there was one question from a fan who said, yeah, I'm reading these team-up stories, and Batman's teaming up with Sergeant Rock and Wildcat, and I don't understand how Batman is able to do that. So, can you explain it for us? And Rozakis, who I think is a bit of an interesting character himself, gave an answer which I think was mostly in jest. And he said, well, let's just say that these stories take place on Earth B. And later, when he was asked about Rozakis, referred to E. Nelson Bridwell and Murray Boltinoff. But later historians would point out that it wasn't just Bridwell and Boltinoff who were writing these stories which didn't jive with DC continuity. Actually, a greater culprit, for lack of a better term, was Bob Haney, or Crazy Bob Haney, as some fans and historians refer to him. I actually want to say it was the majority of the Brave and the Bold issues featuring the Batman team-ups with Spectre and Sergeant Rock and Wildcat that were written by Bob Haney himself. And the designation Earth B, it makes a lot of sense. You think Bridwell, Boltinoff, Bob Haney, Bob Rozakis, Brave and the Bold, and Batman. And so it led historians to start putting together a timeline for this Earth, which was unofficially coined by Mr. Rozakis. And it's a really interesting timeline if you take certain Brave and the Bold and World's Finest Comics stories and put them together. And it really revolves around Batman, which is kind of funny because during the pre-crisis era, Superman was far and away the flagship character of the DCU. But here on Earth B, the exception was that Batman appeared to be the main character on this Earth. And so here's what I've gathered from my research. There's the standard origin for Bruce Wayne that played out on Earths 1 and Earth and 2. Except on Earth B, Batman does start his career in the late 1930s, early 1940s, and he does fight overseas with Sergeant Rock. And then after the war, he comes back to Gotham City. He does take on a partner in Dick Grayson. And from some of my research, I've got to find the story, but apparently in one story, it's revealed that in the Earth B reality, Bruce Wayne was actually going to take Dick Grayson back to the orphanage after Boss Zuko was delivered up to justice for killing Dick Grayson's parents. Another interesting part of the Earth B Batman timeline is that he confronts a Catwoman who has no qualms about killing. She's far more than a cat thief. There's nothing to like about her. She is a cold-blooded murderer. On top of that, as years pass, the Earth B Batman doesn't appear to age, so that by the time of those team-up stories with Wildcat, it's what was then the present day of the 1970s, but the Earth B Batman is still a man in his early to mid-30s. But there's something else that's really fascinating about the Earth B Batman. He had an older brother. And this story played out in World's Finest Comics, issue number 223, and then it was followed up again in issue number 227 of World's Finest. In issue number 223, Batman and Superman are on the hunt for a boomerang killer. And no, it's not Captain Boomerang. But Batman, it seems, is protecting the boomerang killer. And it turns out that Batman learned that 3 years before he was born, his parents had a boy named Thomas Wayne Jr. And tragically, there was a car accident in which Thomas Jr. suffered extensive brain damage. And while the doctor told his parents that he would live a full life,